the power to transform consciousness, both personally and collectively. It has the power to uplift humanity, nurture hearts and souls. It has the power to bring hope and vision to the world. And our guest today is Curt Tofeland, and he brings 38 years of professional theater experience to his role as director, actor, producer, playwright, writer, teacher, program developer, and prison arts practitioner. He is the founder of the internationally acclaimed Shakespeare Behind Bars program. Welcome, Curt.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
I am too. I've been looking forward to this conversation. When I heard about your program, I was like, wow, I need to talk to this man, So I'd love to know what inspired you. Shakespeare Behind Bars. Let's talk about that. What was the inspiration for that, and who or what?
Well, it wasn't necessarily any one specific event. It's always a culmination of lots of different experiences that you have, and I think listening very deeply to the universe and waiting for that moment in time when a door will open and going through that door, because they close really quickly. So what led me into the prison is I was the producing artistic director of Kentucky Shakespeare Festival in Louisville, Kentucky. It's the oldest free, independently operated professional Shakespeare festival in North America. And I had taken over that position of producing artistic director in 1989, and I immediately created an education department. What it had been previous to that was doing free performances in an inner city park every summer, and I wanted to expand that to make it a 12-month a year, and so I wanted to go into the schools. And going into the schools meant that I wanted to work with kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade, so I developed programs specifically developmentally appropriate to those different ages. One of the groups or populations that I always enjoyed serving were those populations that were outcasts, those that were labeled for whatever reason, learning disability, behaviorally challenged, physically challenged, all of those kinds of labels that we put, negative labels we put on human beings. I always went into the classroom and I made sure that they were mainstreamed back into the classroom. A lot of times your kids that have behavioral problems are relegated to a room down the hall while a guest comes into work, because the teacher doesn't want the behavior of those students to reflect badly on his or her him or her as a teacher, or on the class as a whole. And I believe in a holistic approach to education, particularly in those classes prior to middle school, when they get divided into one classroom per hour with 6 different teachers. And so I always wanted them back in, and oftentimes I had to stand my ground and say, no, I'm not going to continue with the workshop until those kids are in the room. Because I knew that when they came into the room, they would be extremely creative, and where they may have learning challenges like reading challenges, and they had to get up in the class and walk out to their remedial reading class, and kids made fun of them, or even if they didn't make fun of them, the kid that has to do that feels, everybody's watching them and thinking, judging them, and thinking quite badly about them. Now, these kids who had this negative view from other kids and personal view of themselves as not being very worthy, they were the creative ones, and of course everybody wanted them on their team. And what I was interested in leaving behind.
Can you talk about the program and how you used it? Because you say you want them on your team. How to explain that a little bit more?
Well, theater is as an art form that I've chosen to pursue professionally, and theater is based not on one person, but it's an ensemble of people. It's people that gather together to put on a work. And so I've been building teams. I've been on teams my whole life. I started playing trumpet in 3rd grade, so I was a part of the band team, and that just continued to progress for my whole life. I'm the eldest of 5 children. That's a team. And so I'm very used to team building and being able to contribute what my talent or abilities were, and being inspired by those that had other talents and abilities. So what I wanted to happen was I wanted the classroom to be a holistic place where all of us could come together, no matter what our race, color, creed, upbringing, poverty, no matter even what the education determined as us being labeled as developmentally challenged, etc. I just wanted people to see, in the circle, to see each other as human beings first, and everyone has a gift to bring to the circle. Of course, that always proved true. The more I did this work in the classroom and in the schools, the more I really found myself wanting to go to that room down the hall where all those bad, quote, bad kids were kept and just work with them exclusively, which eventually I did. And in working with them, that took me to the streets, because you keep backing up from there. Their problems don't arise out of a single cause. They arise out of many causes. And it took me to the streets, and I was working with kids on the streets, again, trying to help them not turn into, quote, juvenile delinquents and end up with a stint in detention center, a juvenile prison, or eventually in an adult prison. And I heard about a program called Books Behind Bars, which was a literacy-based program that was taking middle school students from a very high-risk middle school in Louisville into a prison, Luther Luckett, which is a medium-security adult male prison. The sociologist that started that program was really interested in juvenile delinquency and really dropout rate. He wanted to see if he couldn't curb that. His wife happened to be a psychologist at Luther Luckett, and so she handpicked a group of prisoners to participate from that end. He recruited two amazing teachers who opened their classroom up to the work, and what they did is, in the center of their circles, they placed a book. First books were by Hinton. I think it's E.H. Hinton. Anyway, she's a female writer from Texas who was bullied when she was in school, and she found a voice in writing, and I think she published her first book at 19. And she became quite famous for a film that was made from one of her first books, The Outsiders. It puts teenagers as the protagonists and the antagonists, so the kids loved the novels, H.E. Hinton's novels, and the prisoners enjoyed the novels. Then they brought the two groups together and facilitated a discussion about the book. The sociologist, Curt Bergstrom's idea is that if he could take real kids into a real prison, that perhaps their eyes might open about what prison was all about, and having that experience, sort of a tamer, Scared Straight program, which had...
Right, I was just thinking Scared Straight, yeah.
Which is a very unsuccessful program they did in California, where they brought problem children, problem young people in and had the inmates scream and yell at them, thinking that would change them the way a drill sergeant changes an army recruit. Well, it doesn't work. And so I read about it in the newspaper. I called him up and asked him to lunch. I wanted to know more. And really what I was after is I just was as ignorant as the populace is, because I believed what the media told me, which is that everybody in prison is a juvenile delinquent, and they're they're all one color, and I knew that wasn't true, but I believed that everybody came from juvenile delinquency background, and that if I could learn some interventions from those guys in prison, if I could gain their trust, and they could help me then to dissuade kids on the street who were from the same neighborhood or background that they came from. So that's how I got in, and I fell in love with the work, and I happened to have a teacher that I had trained, a psychologist at Luther Luckett, who had taken my teacher training program from the page to the stage. She was a confirmed Bartophile. She was an undergraduate literature major with an expertise in Shakespeare, and then she became a psychologist. Well, I said to her, I would really like to come back into the prison after witnessing facilitating a master class with prisoners and middle school students. And she said, sure, come on back. So I came back 3 or 4 times there. We were working on Romeo and Juliet, and I gained such insights, and I had so much fun, and learned so much as a human being, and grew as an artist and as a human being, that I said to the guys, I'll keep coming back until you waste my time, and then because I'm volunteering my time, I won't come back. Well, that was almost 22 years ago, and I've just continued to come back. So the inspiration was really to try to gain some ideas about creating an intervention with juveniles so that they don't end up...
What did you learn from this? What were some of your big takeaways as you've done this for 22 years, and has it evolved and changed?
Well, it continues to evolve and change, and obviously, I get more out of the process than I think the participants do. Although the participants always tell me that's not true, they get a lot out of the process. It's an ongoing process because it's a circle of trust, and it's a place where we can examine the human condition, and in examining the human condition, we can come to know ourselves through using art, theater, and the works of William Shakespeare. The reason that I use art is that I believe every human being inherently has in them an artist that lives within them. And if you think back to when somebody's 4 or 5 years old, they're exceedingly creative. That's actually how they learn, is through creativity, trial and error, and creativity. And then they get into school, and by the time they hit third grade, then the whole system changes, and it begins to beat creativity out of them, because now it's about reading, writing, and arithmetic. And those of us that are artists and remain artists just refuse to have that beaten out of us. Our drive is more to continue to remain creative and find a means of expression.
Right.
And so the work that I do is based on this artist that lives within and tapping back into it. And the second part is theater. Why theater? Because it most resembles real life. Film is a film of real life, but it doesn't change no matter whether one person's watching it or a full auditorium or 35,000 people. It doesn't change. Whereas a piece of theater is alive, and it's always changing depending on the audience feedback and the connection between the artist, the playwright's work, and then the audience itself. It's a holy triangle. So
is the audience other members of the prison community, or do you have outsiders come in, family, friends? How does this work?
Well, the way that it works is guys volunteer to be in the circle, the Shakespeare Behind Bars circle. They volunteer. They get nothing for it, no credit. I write them a letter of recommendation. And we begin to explore art, theater, and the works of Shakespeare. The reason I use Shakespeare is that trauma. Every human being at some point goes through trauma. Some people go through severe trauma. Many people who are incarcerated have been those that have gone through severe trauma. And unless the trauma has language, unless you have language for that trauma, it will not be healed. And then a lot of time what happens is violence, alcohol, drugs, things that try to mask it. Of course, it's
right.
It just is an underlying current that goes through. So I use Shakespeare because he has language for any trauma that any human being suffers. And what I try to do is find a character, help them, facilitate them finding a character that speaks eloquently about the trauma they're going through as a character. And what happens to the actor is then the actor begins to understand and explore a character through an aesthetic, which is to tell the truth of the character, to tell the deep truth of the character. And what they do is they learn their own way of then analyzing their own selves and getting to the roots and of the trauma that they've experienced, and then many times thrust that trauma on someone else. So it's about healing. And in the safety of the circle, which is a circle built on trust, it's a circle built on confidentiality, it's a circle built on virtues and values, not on rules and regulations. It has higher ideals. And within that circle, the exploration begins, and we begin to tell our stories. Now, what happens when a story is being told is you as the person, as the audience member, you either relate to that story because it's parallel to something that happened in your life, or it might be totally foreign and you have no experience, but when you listen to someone telling their story, what happens is you find empathy and you find compassion. And that's the most important quality of a human being to develop, is empathy. So really the work that we're doing is to find the empathy within ourselves through exploring our own stories, telling our own stories, inspiring others in the circle, or through feeling compassion for what someone's gone through.
I love that, because and I believe it's in all the arts, and that you can do that. Whether it's my thing is writing or painting. I was talking to somebody yesterday. It was about music. And sharing his music in the same way, and noticing how they went through their process. Of the pain first, and then releasing that into the healing aspects, and then being an inspiration. It was really important to take it from one step to another to be that light for somebody else. That there is so much in the piece of being of service that changes you as well as the witness of whatever you're sharing.
Yes,
Yeah, I love that. So can I ask you about, what have been some of your challenges in doing this? Funding, I assume, is part of this, and who are your collaborative partners, and how has that worked for you over the time it has to have changed?
Well, funding is always the issue because nobody wants to put money into prisoners. You're not going to get money from the corporate world to be able to take it into prisons because the view is so shaped by media about who we have locked up. The public really doesn't understand who we have locked up, and the reason that they don't is that they don't investigate it. They don't investigate it because they believe that the media is telling them the truth about, or the media, I'm also including film, television, or written chronicles about it. And so it's very, very difficult to find funding. We're a 501c3. We're a not-for-profit. That happened after I left Kentucky Shakespeare Festival after 20 years of service. I took that program with me. And when I was at Kentucky Shakespeare Festival, I just made the work that I did a part of my job description. So I was being paid for my job. Therefore, I didn't have any expenses as far as artist activity to be paid, so it was quite an inexpensive program to run. When I left and took it out, and my partner Matt Wallace and I turned it into a 501c3, I moved to Michigan and started all over. Matt continues to run the program in Kentucky. We now had to raise our own funds, which we do primarily through patron donations. That's really how it's done, is person to person. We also get some money from family foundations when we can find a family foundation that has social justice at the center of one of its values and wants to fund it. I've been a Fulbright scholar twice, so you can find foundation money, like through the Fulbright, that supports you to do the work. That's the hardest thing to keep it alive, is the funding. The second hardest thing is the institution itself. Prisons are not built to allow people to come and go. Prisons are very insular. Most people in corrections don't want you to know what's going on behind the walls and the razor wire. And it's a very suspicious, deadly, dark, closed environment to go into. And so for somebody like myself who's a volunteer, doesn't get paid by corrections to come in and go out, a lot of times they would just soon not allow you in because there's a lot of fear about what you may discover, what you may reveal, or they may couch it in saying, well, we're concerned for your safety. And so you're always wrestling with the institution. If you have a warden who is a visionary and not a boss, then you can make headway, because visionaries, and there are visionaries in corrections, that's not how it normally operates, but I've been very fortunate in the 22 years that I've worked in corrections here in Australia and in New Zealand, to work with visionaries, with leaders who saw the value of what it is. They may not have understood it, but they saw the values. They also saw the outcomes, which is a reduction of violence on the yard, and our recidivism rate for men who have been through the program, based on 22 years of tracking them in Kentucky, we have a 5.1% recidivism rate. It's extremely low, and I
love that. I interviewed for my book a woman who had been in prison, and she started the first cancer walk, and when she got out, she created a program with Martha Mertz of Athena International. Her name's Sue Ellen Allen. And what I loved is her program has become so popular that she was actually sitting with Michelle Obama at the State of the Union this year, because here is a woman who took her trials and tribulations and turned it around and found her passion, how to help other women who are in prison. So there are people who care and that are wanting to make a difference, and I love what you're sharing. So I think it's really critical, like you said, that we spread the word that there are things that you can do to change our view of what prison is and who the population is, and that there is hope, that they are not doomed to repeat the past always.
Right. And the important thing with recidivism rates, of course, government doesn't tell the truth. Most states, if you've been out of prison for 2 or 3 years, commit a crime, are convicted and sent back to prison. They call it a new crime. It's really recidivism, but they don't want the public to know what a miserable, dismal failure our prison system is, as far as doing the habilitation part of what should be in corrections. Of course, there's punishment in that, but it's beyond punishment if we're going to live in a society where 95, 96% of those who are incarcerated are going to come back out. How do we want them to come out? We want them to come out, I think, habilitated, because they're going to be living in our neighborhood. And so they do smoke and mirrors with recidivism rates. I just find it's easier to tell the truth. So if a man has been in our program for over a year and gets out and 10 years down the road commits a crime and gets convicted and comes back to prison, I count it as a recidivism rate. I'm happy to say ours is truly 5.1%, and I'm also happy to say that within that 5.1% of guys who've returned, none of them returned for violent crimes, although in the initial there was violence, but none of them came back. Most of them came back for economic reasons. They couldn't get a job. They turned to stealing, robbing. And I'm also happy to say that of those 5.1% that came back, they're back out and have not come back.
Oh, that's wonderful. So I'm curious, because you are involved in the system and stuff. I think the other thing is it's a private, how many private prisons there are now, that it's a corporation that's making money. So there is also that piece of that feeds into this whole thing with the media, that, there's an economic advantage, to having full prisons.
Of course, because it's an industrial prison complex. That's really what it is. And what you are is exactly true. There are too many people that make money on the backs of our prisoners. And so it's very difficult to change anything when people are making money on it. There's more lobbyists in Washington lobbying for longer sentences and everything that's the negative of the way it should go towards habilitation, towards release, towards bringing them back into the community. Because there's people making money on mattresses and beds and food and uniforms and constructing prisons and all of those things. And the moment that economics is involved in anything, it gets corrupted. And the corruption has to do with greed. And that's one of the things that we as human beings seem to have in abundance is they say that power corrupts, and absolute power absolutely corrupts. And I think that's what I witnessed. Again, it doesn't mean that there aren't great people working in corrections and trying to solve the problems, and I've been very fortunate to work in parallel with them. It's why I've been able to stay in a prison for a very long time. And this program that I started up here has expanded. I've been in prison here, 2 prisons here, and I started the original Circle over 6 years ago. It's still going. The prison, the Circle in Kentucky is in its 22nd season of existence.
Oh.
Been through multiple wardens since then, multiple directors or commissioners of the Department of Correction, multiple governors, etc., Republican one year, one time Democratic the next. We've really transcended all of those, again, because I think we make a compelling story about what I think most people in corrections which are concerned about, and that is violence. And we can reduce and have reduced violence on the yard. It makes it a safer place for prisoners. It makes it a safer place for the officers that are there. And then on the outside, for what government ends up being concerned about, because budgets have to fund this, is our recidivism rate is so low, when the reality is that I saw a statistic that after 5 years of being released, 86 or 7% of those released come back to prison. I mean, that's really one of my colleagues as a warden was Warden Larry Chandler in Kentucky. He's if you've seen the Shakespeare Behind Bars documentary by Philom F. Films, he is the warden that is in charge of the prison when that film was made about my program. Larry was always able to put it quite down to earth. He said, if you go out and try to start your car and it doesn't start 87% of the time, would you say you had a good car? Yeah, I think at that time Kentucky's recidivism rate, and again it's not the true recidivism rate, it's with smoke and mirrors, was about 33%. So he could say if you went out and your car didn't start 33% of the time, would you think you had a good car? That's really the way that things should be evaluated. He always said you should evaluate us by our success rate of releasing men from prison and them not coming back. He said that's truly what we should be evaluated on.
Okay, I love that. Well, let me talk about your actual creativity in the sense of how do you define creativity?
Oh, really for me, creativity is a means of expression, and the means of expression has to do trying to understand this thing that we are gifted with, which is life, and all the trials and tribulations that can happen, and all the suffering that can happen in our life. So for me, creativity is about trying to understand the humanness that's in me, and to express that humanness, and to do that in a collaborative way with other artists, and also in a collaborative way with an audience, a live audience.
I love that. I love that. I do believe in the power of collaboration and co-creation. You know, that we need to have different visions presented. Like you're totally giving a different vision of what is possible. You know, that people can be released from prison, that the recidivism rate is down, violence is down, and those are the stories that people need to hear so they can get behind this and understand that there can be social change by creatively expressing yourself, and I think that's really important. So what could one person do today to make a difference? You know, they're hearing your story. What are some of the things you would suggest to them if they're concerned about prisons and reform and social justice?
Well, obviously I'm not attempting to change the industrial prison complex because I can't. I just do what it is that I can do, which is I can, if I gain permission, go into a prison and work with a group of prisoners, male, female, or juveniles. Doesn't make any difference. And that is to explore what it means to be a human being. And in the exploration of what it is to be a human being, they're transformed, and that transformation then infects, I can use infection as a positive word, infects the rest of the culture because they begin to act differently on the art. They begin to be peacemakers rather than troublemakers. So for me, it was finding my way into prison through the aesthetic and exploring that using art, theater, and Shakespeare. So I think that quintessentially then has become what my I guess my gift or what my passion is. I still work professionally as an actor and as a director. That's because I'm still impassioned about doing that, and I need to make a living. But I could really give all of that up because I've been there and I've done that, but I don't think I know I could never give up the prison component of it or working with people who are post-incarceration. And I'm very interested in starting a program using the arts for post-traumatic stress syndromes in our soldiers who've been returned from the wars of the last 20 years. Who the government doesn't do a very good job of unpacking them, and it's shameful that a lot of our vets coming back who put their life on the line end up in one of three places: in the graveyard, in the prison, or on the streets. And so I'm really interested in taking the work, and I know that it works because I've worked with those vets that end up in prison. And I can see the healing and the transformation that happens. So I know I can make that work on the street, and so I'm pushing in that direction to see if I can't find my way into the VA. Now that post-traumatic stress syndrome is talked about a lot more, and people are actually looking at starting programs.
There is a program called the Vet Art Program. And
yes.
It's by Lisa Peacock, and she actually is getting her PhD in theater and drama.
Yeah.
So she's done an amazing job of starting the talk-back dialogues and all that, using poetry and all that kind of stuff. So I love that. What I wanted to ask you is, so I'm thinking about, you've worked with kids all the way up to adults. Is there one piece of Shakespeare that really people should be looking at, and we could have a conversation about that? Which story should people be looking at for the human experience, do you think?
Well,
you had to pick one.
I always start with to be or not to be, Hamlet's speech, because it means to be or not to be, and however you define be, it can be live, die, be a good person, be a bad person, whatever it is. I start with that because it's an introspective process that Hamlet's going through, giving voice to his collective thoughts. And when I came to Michigan after doing the program for 13 years in Kentucky, I began to write and publish. The reason that I did that is because there were things that had been written and published about Shakespeare behind bars that were not true. And so the public was having, now people were writing PhDs and they were looking to published works and they were quoting untruths. So I decided, well, if somebody's got to do it, it has to be me. So I started writing and publishing. Now, when you sit down to write, I've been a poet since third grade, so I am continuous, and I'm a journaler. So I do consider myself a writer. I've published some poetry. But now when I would start writing about something about Shakespeare behind bars and how does that work, it really synthesizes and streamlines all of the experiences that you have into a succinct, interesting, truthful piece of writing. What came of that work, that synthesis, is I came up with 4 questions. And the 4 questions that everyone in the circle is trying to answer for themselves, because when we sit in the circle, we're there to fix ourselves. We're not there to fix anybody else. Advice is forbidden. Don't give any advice. Tell me a story. And because I'm there to fix me. The first question is, who am I? The second question is, what do I love? The third question is, how will I live my life knowing I will die? And the fourth question is what is my gift to humankind? Now, those 4 questions streamlined down from probably about 50 questions, but I finally found 4 that I think, for me as a human being, were the most meaningful. And as I've shared them in this work and with others on the street, I found that it was valuable for them to explore, who am I? So Hamlet starts out with, to be or not to be. That is the question. So it's about a question. Live in the questions, not in the answers. The moment you have an answer for me, I'm walking away, because that answer might be for you, but it may not be for me. But do you have a question that might help me find my own answer? And that's really where the power is deep, deep questioning. So the piece of Shakespeare is that I explore first is that long monologue that he has where he's trying to figure things out. And the second question is, what do I love? Well, what or who? That love is the Beatles said, love is the answer. It's true. Sometimes hard to get to, hard to get at. But when you begin to ask that question, sometimes it comes out, well, I love heroin. That's really what I love. But then you have to dig below that. Well, why is it that you love heroin? And oftentimes what you find below that is some trauma that's happened. And, of course, there's genetics that play into this, and there's opiates are the easiest to become addicted because they change the brain chemistry. So there's a lot that's involved in it. And then the question of how you're going to live your life knowing you'll die. We're all terminal. Nobody gets out of life alive. So how are you going to live your life is a big question that I ask myself every day. What brings meaning, and for me, what I've discovered is that you don't look for meaning. There is no search for the Holy Grail. You make meaning, and you make meaning right where you are. And for me, making meaning has to do with being of service to others. That's where I get my biggest kick and my biggest charge. And in being of service to others, I am in service to myself because I'm growing as a human being and learning. And the last question is legacy. I don't have grandchildren yet, hoping for that.
It's pretty cool. I love it. So
I'm too old to live past the point where I'll have great-grandchildren. But what interests me is how are my children going to talk about me? How are my grandchildren going to talk about me when I'm gone? They hopefully will have known me. But how will my great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren talk about me? That's the legacy that I leave. And so I think about that. What kind of legacy do I want to leave? Well, when you're working in corrections, it's like, who am I? I'm a criminal. What do I love? I love heroin. I love money. I love stealing, robbing, raping, and pillaging. How will I live my life knowing I will die? Man, I'm going to get the most out of it that I can before I drop off. And how do I want to be remembered? Well, I don't really care how I'm remembered, or I want to be remembered as a badass, Those are all easy answers to deep questions. And the exploration of those questions, for me, help define me as a human being.
I love that. I mean, I totally, it's like you're reading the first chapter of my book, because those were the questions I was asking. Whose lives do you want to touch? How do you want to be remembered? And I know when I wrote the book and I did this summit, I mean, the whole point, I said, I want my children and grandchildren to see me as a role model, a mentor and a volunteer, because I believe in service. I believe in creative expression as my gift, and I love to share people's stories. So I loved how you put it. I loved your 4 questions. And do you have any final thoughts for people?
No, I think as soon as you start digging into that first question of who am I, I think it takes a lot of courage to take a hard look at yourself. Hamlet says, "Hold as it were the mirror up to nature," meaning hold the mirror up to yourself, because looking into your eyes and looking at yourself, that's really who you are. What do you see? I think when we get in touch with our humanity, we cannot help but reach out and help others who are different or less fortunate than we are. And I go back to indigenous populations. A lot of the work that I do is based on indigenous population, hunter-gatherers. Every country has an indigenous population. We don't treat them very well, sadly, here in America. We don't treat them very well in Australia. We treat them not quite so badly in New Zealand, but we still treat them badly. But it's all based on that small community that could ill afford to lose anyone. So when someone did harm to someone in the community, they were brought into the circle of elders. And in the circle of elders, there were those there was the person who had hurt, and then there were those who had been hurt. And what the person who had been hurt said to the perpetrator is they told that perpetrator how they'd been hurt, to help that perpetrator understand that the actions had hurt someone. And eventually, of course, it comes in, now you really have hurt one person, but look at all the family members who are hurt. Look at your side of the equations and all the people that are in your family who've been hurt, and then look at the tribe itself. And see how it's hurt. It's now called restorative justice, but they were practicing it way back when. And we've lost touch with a lot of that. So I try to read and be in touch with that, because I think that it works. It's about building a community. So the question is, who am I in this community that I'm in, and following the passion for what it is that you want to do. And people say, I don't have a passion. Say, well, you can find it, but you'll find it through an exploration of who you really are and what you really love, and how do you want to be remembered, and what it is, if you're in retirement age, how do I want to live my life knowing I will die? That starts at retirement age. Maybe prior to that you didn't live your life so well, or maybe you were unfulfilled by the life that you led. It's never too late. You can always start. And for me, it starts with being of service to others, because it takes the you in you out of you and puts it somewhere else. It puts it in other people, and that's how we help each other, one person at a time.
Thank you so much. And how can people get a hold of you?
Visit our website, which is simply ShakespeareBehindBars.org, O-R-G. If you put .com, it'll take you to the Philomath Films award-winning documentary about the work. But it's ShakespeareBehindBars.org, and there's lots and lots of information. My email is there if people want to contact me, and there's lots of material there. You could spend quite a long time going through it, seeing it, because what I've tried to use that website is as a clearinghouse, because we prison arts practitioners don't have a network. I've worked in the last 4 or 5 years to try to create that by creating conferences where we can bring prison arts practitioners, particularly interested in art, theater, and some interested in Shakespeare from around the globe, together to talk and share ideas and to be of service to each other.
Well, thank you so much, Curt. I so appreciate you being with us today. And to our listeners, take a look at those 4 questions. It's a time to start, to look at yourself, answer, who am I? It's the beginning of everything. And Curt, thank you so much, and I hope you'll be listening to the rest of our calls, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray.